The morning of April 13th, 1945, was damp with the scent of wet earth, the heavy sky above the German town of Falkenstein pressing down on its stone streets. It was a town caught between history's shifting tides, a place where old soldiers and weary civilians braced themselves for what they knew was inevitable: American forces closing in on the crumbling Reich. The air was thick with the sound of distant artillery, the rumble of tanks shaking the earth like thunder. Falkenstein, a strategic point along the American advance, had become a point of focus in the late stages of the war. As the Allies drove further into the heart of the Third Reich, they encountered not only military resistance but also the collapsing walls of civilian life in the dim light of early morning. There was no visible sign of the chaos that would soon engulf this quiet town. No one could hear the distant echoes of approaching troops or feel the tremor of war pressing ever closer. Yet, in a small, modest house just outside the main square, one woman prepared for the unimaginable. The woman, amateur named Ingrid Schneider, had been living in constant fear for the safety of her two young sons. Her husband had been called into service by the Nazi regime, and by early 1945, the war had left him nowhere to be found. Presumed dead in the endless trenches of the Eastern Front, her home had become both a sanctuary and a prison, where she kept the remnants of her family safe from the horrors unfolding around them. But as the Americans advanced, the reality of defeat loomed large. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the village, the thunderous rumble of American tanks sending vibrations through the earth, announcing their arrival. Ingrid's mind raced as she paced the narrow corridors of her home. She had heard the stories of the ruthless Allied forces, of families torn apart, of children caught in the crossfire. Her boys, no older than 11 and 13, were the last pieces of her world, and she would do anything to protect them. Falkenstein had no real defense anymore, and Ingrid knew it. The Wehrmacht had long since abandoned the area, leaving behind a shattered landscape of broken defenses and hollow promises. The local Nazi militia had made its retreat days earlier, leaving the civilians to fend for themselves. American troops were expected to arrive any moment, and Ingrid feared what would happen to her children when they did. She knew that the Americans had little patience for the civilian population, especially those who had been part of the German war effort, even indirectly, but Ingrid wasn't about to let that fate befall her children. Deep within the walls of her home, hidden behind layers of dirt and old furniture, she had prepared a secret, a tunnel. This wasn't just any tunnel. It was her lifeline. Her father had been an engineer before the war, and he had built this very tunnel as part of an old underground escape route. The tunnel had long since been abandoned by the military, left to rot under the weight of time and the war, but Ingrid had reclaimed it in secret, maintaining its hidden entrance, just in case. It was her last resort. The sounds of military trucks grew louder outside, their engines roaring closer. Ingrid's heart raced as she hurriedly gathered her children. "Quickly now," she whispered urgently. Her voice barely broke the silence of the house, but it carried the weight of a mother's desperate plea. Her sons, Tobias and Hans, were already dressed, their faces pale and drawn, their young minds unable to fully comprehend the danger they were in. Ingrid was trying to remain calm, but her every step was weighed down by the fear that they might not make it in time. The entrance to the tunnel was in the cellar, beneath the trapdoor hidden under an old rug. Ingrid motioned for her sons to follow her, lifting the rug with shaking hands. As the trapdoor creaked open, she descended into the dark, musty tunnel first, then helped her children follow her down, one at a time. The tunnel was narrow, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew. It felt like they were entering another world, one where time had stopped, where the bombs and battles above could not touch them. The echoes of the American soldiers grew louder. Ingrid could hear them now, their voices in the distance, their footsteps trampling over the earth above. Her sons, clutching her hands tightly, moved in silence, their eyes wide in the dark. The faint light from a single lantern illuminated their faces, casting shadows that danced across the tunnel walls. They had been down here for what felt like an eternity when Ingrid's heart skipped a beat. The sounds of footsteps above had stopped. Had the soldiers found them? She held her breath, her chest tightening. The air in the tunnel grew thick, and for a moment, she feared they might be trapped, unable to escape. But then, the distant sound of the soldiers' boots resumed their march, growing fainter with each passing second. Ingrid exhaled in relief. They weren't discovered, but they had no time to waste. The tunnel was their only hope, and she had no intention of letting it be the end of them. The plan was simple: head south, toward the Swiss border. If they could make it to the edge of the town, they would be in a forested area where they could find shelter and safety. The Americans were more focused on military targets, and civilians, especially women and children, were not high on their list. Ingrid had heard rumors that some German families had managed to escape, hiding in nearby villages or slipping across the border. She was determined to make it there, to save her sons, no matter the cost. They crawled through the dark, the tunnel stretching on, twisting and turning beneath the earth. The weight of the moment was crushing. Every footstep above, every distant rumble of an engine, and every distant cry in the village felt like a countdown. Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that the Americans were closing in. Time was running out. The tunnel was their lifeline, but how long would it last? Would they make it out in time? Would the Americans, or worse, the SS troops, find them before they could escape? As the tunnel twisted ahead, leading them deeper into the earth, Ingrid's thoughts turned to the world above, to the family that had once been whole, to the future that seemed impossibly distant now. And yet, she knew she had to press on. For her children, for their survival. The air grew colder as they moved further into the darkness, the sounds of the outside world fading away, swallowed up by the earth. The escape was just beginning, but the danger was far from over. What lay ahead in the darkness of the tunnel, and what would they find at the end of their journey? Only time would tell, and for Ingrid, it was a race against the clock in the distance. The faint sound of an American radio crackled to life, a reminder of the world that awaited them on the other side. The further they crawled, the darker and colder the tunnel became. Ingrid Schneider's mind raced with thoughts, each more frantic than the last. She held her breath as she heard the faint crackle of radios and the sound of soldiers shouting, growing fainter, then louder again. Her sons, Tobias and Hans, were growing tired, their small hands gripping hers tightly as they moved in the dark, but they did not speak. There was no time for questions now. They simply followed, their feet heavy, their bodies weighed down by the oppressive air of the tunnel. The tunnel they crawled through was a relic of the past, designed long before the war had torn through the fabric of Germany. It had been part of a network built by her father, an engineer who had worked on various underground projects for the Reich, but now it was little more than a forgotten passage. The walls, once reinforced with steel, were now crumbling, the remnants of a world that had faded into dust. Ingrid's heart hammered in her chest, knowing that her father's foresight was now her only hope. For a moment, they stopped to rest. Ingrid lit a small lantern, the flickering flame casting ghostly shadows on the walls around them. Tobias leaned against her, his eyes closed, his face streaked with dirt and fear. Hans, ever the more inquisitive, looked at his mother with wide eyes. "Mother, where are we going?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if the words might bring the soldiers above closer. "To safety," Ingrid replied softly, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. "We'll make it to Switzerland. Just keep moving and don't look back." But in the depths of her mind, Ingrid wasn't so sure. Could they really make it? Would they be able to escape the tightening grip of the American forces? The Allies were sweeping through the countryside, and they were drawing closer with every hour. And the tunnel, though hidden, could only protect them for so long. How long before it would be discovered? How long before their escape would end in failure? As the tunnel curved, Ingrid's thoughts turned to the mechanics of their survival. This was not a well-trodden escape route. It was an old, forgotten passageway that had been sealed off years before the war. The air was damp and musty, the sound of dripping water echoing down the tunnel as the family made their way deeper underground. The cold had begun to bite at their skin, and Ingrid's breath came out in visible puffs, fogging the lantern's light. But even in this darkness, even with the fear of capture closing in on her, Ingrid found the faintest spark of hope. Her father had built the tunnel with precision, engineered to withstand the wear and tear of time and the shifting earth. It had been his legacy, his contribution to the war effort, but now it was her only lifeline. She could almost feel him with her as she crawled deeper into the earth. Hours seemed to pass in an agonizing blur. Her sons, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, continued to crawl behind her. Every so often, Ingrid would turn back and encourage them, her voice strained but full of love and determination. Tobias, his small face pale and dirty, gave her a weak smile, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Hans, on the other hand, was quieter and more withdrawn, his hands trembling as he held onto his mother's jacket. They had not spoken of what would happen once they reached Switzerland. Ingrid had no answers for them. She only knew that they had to make it out of Germany, out of this war, alive. But where could they go? How could they survive once they crossed the border? These thoughts swirled in Ingrid's mind, threatening to overwhelm her, but she could not afford to lose focus. Her children needed her at long last. The tunnel began to narrow, its once spacious passage now cramped and claustrophobic. The walls seemed to close in on them, and Ingrid's breath became shallow as she fought to keep herself composed. The light from the lantern flickered dangerously, casting long shadows along the walls, as though the tunnel itself were alive, watching, waiting. Then, suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. A low, rumbling noise, far too close for comfort. Ingrid's heart skipped a beat as the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The vibrations grew stronger, and she could feel the air shift around them. Were the Americans above them already? Were they about to discover the tunnel? "Stay quiet," she whispered urgently to her sons. "Do not make a sound." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her command was clear. Tobias and Hans stiffened, their eyes wide with fear. Ingrid held her breath, her body tense, her ears straining for any sign of the soldiers above. The rumbling grew louder, then faded away, replaced by a strange silence. Ingrid could not afford to waste any more time. They had to move faster. The tunnel was leading them deeper into unknown territory. There was no turning back now. But before she could urge her sons to continue, the ground shook again. This time, it was not a tremor from above. This time, it was a thundering sound that could only be one thing: an explosion. The earth cracked open above them, dust and debris falling into the tunnel. Ingrid recoiled, instinctively shielding her children with her body. The explosion reverberated through the tunnel, the walls shaking violently as if the earth itself was rejecting their presence. Ingrid's heart pounded in her chest as the echo of the blast continued to rumble through the tunnel. Had the Americans found them? Was this the end of their escape? "Quickly, we have to move," she shouted, her voice tight with panic, but there was no time to hesitate. The tunnel had just become more dangerous. They needed to reach the end. Now, with a renewed sense of urgency, Ingrid led her sons forward, moving as fast as the cramped tunnel allowed. Each step felt like a lifetime, but they couldn't stop. The enemy was closing in, and time was running out. The escape was no longer about simply reaching Switzerland. It had become about survival. The danger was everywhere, and as they crawled deeper into the bowels of the earth, Ingrid could only pray they would make it out before the Americans discovered their hiding place. The weight of the world hung on this journey, and the tunnel, their only escape, might soon be their tomb. The tunnel stretched on, a dark and winding path through the earth that seemed to go on forever. Ingrid's every movement was now driven by a singular, all-consuming goal: to escape. The explosion above them had shaken her to the core, the very earth rumbling beneath her feet, but it had also galvanized her resolve. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The sound of American soldiers, the vibrations of their vehicles, the looming fear of discovery, it all threatened to tear apart the fragile hope she clung to. Her sons, Tobias and Hans, were silent now, too exhausted to speak, their faces pale and gaunt. They followed her wordlessly, clinging to the only security they had left: their mother. The tunnel was their lifeline, but it was also a claustrophobic prison, its damp walls pressing in on them, its sharp turns and jagged rocks making each movement more difficult. Still, Ingrid pressed on, the flickering lantern casting fleeting shadows across the walls, the faint light illuminating their path, but not enough to fully guide them through the darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling, the rustle of their clothing, and the sound of their breath. Every sound above ground, every distant rumble, made Ingrid's heart race. She kept her pace steady, urging her children forward, their small bodies barely able to keep up with her determined strides. Tobias, ever the thoughtful one, still held his mother's hand tightly, but his grip was weaker now. His energy nearly spent, they reached another narrow stretch in the tunnel, its air growing colder and more suffocating. Ingrid's lungs burned with the effort of breathing in the stale, damp air. She could hear the sound of her heart pounding in her chest, a constant reminder of the perilous situation they were in. The world above had become a distant memory, a place of chaos and violence. A place where survival was a matter of luck, but luck was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. Hours had passed since the explosion, and Ingrid had no idea how much longer they would have to stay in the tunnel. The darkness seemed endless, as if they were trapped in a void, caught between life and death. The light from their lantern flickered ominously, casting an eerie glow that seemed to make the shadows grow longer and deeper. Each step felt like an eternity, but Ingrid kept her mind focused on one thing. They had to keep moving forward. There was no turning back. Her thoughts turned again to the world above, to the American soldiers. Would they find the tunnel? Would they follow the trail of destruction left by the explosion? Ingrid shuddered at the thought. She couldn't allow her sons to fall into the hands of the enemy. The war had already taken so much from them. Her husband, her home, her sense of safety. She couldn't let it take her children too. She had heard the stories of women and children caught in the crossfire of the war, of families torn apart by the brutal advance of the Allies. Ingrid knew she couldn't let that happen to her. She couldn't let her sons become casualties of a war that had taken everything else from them. She had to get them out. The tunnel twisted again, the walls narrowing even further, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Ingrid's mind began to race again. Was this the end? Was there any hope left? The war was over for Germany, but it wasn't over for her. Not yet. Then, suddenly, a sound broke the stillness that it was faint at first, barely audible, but it was there, footsteps. The unmistakable sound of boots crunching against the dirt above them. Ingrid froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to her sons, her eyes wide with panic, but they were already looking up at her, their faces filled with fear. They could hear it too. For a moment, the world above seemed to cease, the footsteps echoing in the silence, growing louder, closer. Ingrid's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the panic rising within her. They couldn't be found, not now. Not after everything they had been through. Quiet, she whispered, her voice barely audible, a harsh breath escaping her lips. She motioned for her children to stay close, her eyes scanning the dark tunnel, her ears straining to hear any movement from above. The footsteps above were unmistakable, but they seemed to be moving away, growing fainter. Ingrid held her breath, praying that the soldiers hadn't heard them. The sound of boots slowly receded, but the tension in the tunnel was unbearable. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare make a sound. They had to wait. Minutes passed in silence. Ingrid's mind raced, her thoughts darting from one fearful possibility to the next. What if the soldiers had heard them? What if they were just waiting for the right moment to strike? What if this was the end? Then, with a suddenness that took Ingrid's breath away, the sound of the footsteps stopped entirely. The silence in the tunnel was deafening, the absence of sound almost as terrifying as the footsteps themselves. For what felt like an eternity, they waited, crouching in the darkness, unable to move, unable to breathe. Ingrid's thoughts were consumed by the terror of being discovered. She could feel the cold sweat dripping down her spine, the tension in her muscles so intense that she feared they would snap. But then, the silence broke. The sound of a distant motor, the unmistakable hum of a vehicle engine, rumbled faintly from above. The Americans were still out there, but they had not found them. Ingrid's heart pounded in her chest as the engine noise grew fainter, then disappeared altogether. She let out a slow, relieved breath. The danger had passed, for now, but the feeling of dread still lingered. They had to keep moving. They had to get to the end of the tunnel. Ahead of them, the tunnel finally began to widen, its narrow walls opening up into a small chamber. Ingrid's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the end of the tunnel? Could they finally be free? The air in the chamber was fresher, and a sliver of light could be seen at the far end of the room. Ingrid hurried forward, pulling her children with her. They were so close now. The light at the end of the tunnel was in sight. But even as she moved toward the exit, Ingrid knew the war was not done with them yet. The final challenge lay ahead. The American forces were still out there, and though the tunnel had protected them so far, it was no guarantee of safety. And as Ingrid stepped into the light, the world above her seemed both impossibly close and frighteningly far away.